Okay, now let's tick through some competitiveness issues.
Sure.
Public-private partnerships.
Yes.
Legislation that has been pushed would really just set up a framework so that things are kind of set in stone. Right now, there's not really a good system for it. How do you feel about public-private partnerships?
I'm fine with that. I am very skeptical about the actual specific deals, however. And I'll put it to you like this. So as I understand it, the bridge between Louisville and Indiana, Indiana paid for their side of it with a PPP. So my question really is like, I have not examined the deal structure because it's Indiana. Whatever they did is whatever they did. But if you have a hedge fund or a financial company looking to invest in that, that automatically tells us that's a good deal. So, if the state had the capacity to take that deal also on the same terms, it probably should, right? So that would be how I'd at least evaluate the deal anyhow, is like if private guys would jump on it 2 seconds, maybe we could make this a little more competitive. Maybe we could bid this out. Like say, hey, we got a $3 billion public-private partnership that wants to bid on this bridge. Anybody else? Because we're going to have to do this. And also in such a way that it's structured so that it doesn't harm the people who have to use the thing, it harms them as least as possible. It does the least amount of damage. So for example, like with bridges, you've got tolling, which is probably, because if they can't make money off it, I'm pretty sure the Indiana deal is not let's hang KFC ads off the side of it and we'll make all our money, or we'll name it the Colonel Sanders Memorial Bridge. That would be a great deal, by the way. But the upshot is that we have to take a look at the deal structure also and make sure, like, is this a good deal? Like, did we get a good return on their investment, basically? Like, does this work for us in the best way? So I would scrutinize the heck out of those and make them open bidding. But other than that, again, each deal is different, but I'm not opposed to it.
Well, and like you said, tolling is what's holding it up at this
Right.
point because of the Brent Spence Bridge in northern Kentucky. So, are you open to tolling? Really, the problem that northern Kentuckians say is they go to work in Cincinnati. So they're the ones bearing the burden, and that's why we're having such a problem at this point. So how do you feel about that in general, the tolling of that bridge?
Yeah, so I keep, one of the things that I've run into on this campaign so far is libertarians love me. And I keep having to tell them I'm not libertarian. I mean, I'm close, probably. But here's where it ends, is basically like, I like no taxes, but we got to have bridges and roads and schools and these things. And so you can't have no taxes and infrastructure. So there has to be some way to pay for this one way or the other. It would be nice if the federal government would kick in the entire amount, but let's assume they won't do that.
They're not going to.
If they don't, then the only possible way to get this built is with tolls. There just isn't, the money's not sitting around in an account we haven't tapped yet. I mean, it's just not there. So if that's the case, and if the actual problem then is, okay, so you don't want to soak the locals for that much, if possible. You want to try to make sure that the people who use it all the time are the ones that get the break. So I came up with a unique technological idea for this that I think might work depending. One of the ideas floated was, it was like locals pay $1 and non-locals pay $2. Well, okay, so then the question is, well, how do you decide, right? Well, what if I live in Lexington and I work in Dayton and I'm going across that bridge twice a day? Like, how do we make sure, like, that would technically count as local-ish. I mean, they use it all the time. So the idea is based on a couple of different tolling systems I've seen used in different states. So we all are familiar with the transponder version, which is what Chicago and New York use, where you've got a transponder and you roll through on the fast tolling lane, detects the transponder, deducts out of your account, on you go. So that's one way to do it. Denver recently built a beltway around the outside of their city in order to get to the airport, which was built almost in Kansas, I think. Not really, but it was so far out there that it's hard to believe Denver is even actually a part of this area. And they built a giant beltway around it, and they put a toll on it with a transponder, and nobody used it because nobody lived there. And it was like, I'm not going to pay money for that. I can drive on the free road. So they did. So in order to get people to use it, they did an interesting thing. They got rid of the transponders. And so now, if you jump on that toll road, they use high-speed cameras to photograph your license plate. So now you don't need a transponder, which was the only thing they needed to get me to use it. Because I don't live in Colorado. I don't have a transponder, but if I can just jump on this thing and get a photograph of my license plate, fantastic. So now we're talking. And so the idea is basically this. That's how you can let people opt in or opt out to differentiate, are you local or not? Are you local? Buy a transponder, it's $1. Everybody else, photograph the license plate, $5. The reason why is because you can hit semi-tractor trailer traffic that's going across multiple states that way. And they could drive around. We're not forcing you to go across, but that gives locals the option to go, okay, you know what? I don't want to pay $5 every time I go across this thing. And I'm not set in stone on these numbers, by the way, but the upshot is that's a way you could do pricing to allow locals to have a cheaper option than anybody else. Interestingly, also on the tolling, it turns out that I believe in the Kentucky's Constitution, it says that if a toll road pays for itself, you must remove the tolls. And I think that is one of the major concerns about this is are they just going to leave it up? Because Ohio might. I don't know that they have that in their Constitution. But we can't. So good news, like, when I was a kid, early 1980s, tolls came off of the parkway right around the corner from my house, and it was because it had paid for itself. So we don't have to worry about that eventuality. The other idea I had was that it was from LA. LA has, they have flex pricing for carpool lanes. Because for whatever reason, no matter how bad the traffic gets in LA, nobody will carpool, and they have these carpool lanes that nobody's in. So in order to make use of this, they decided to put flex pricing on it. So during rush hour, it goes up and down based on how many people are in it already. So for example, the first time I noticed this, I landed in LAX, I was driving due east to Palm Springs. It's an absolute parking lot on, I think it's the 110. And then nobody's in the carpool lane, or there's a few people, but you see the flex price at the end, it says $6. So it's like, basically, are you driving by yourself? Would you like to get in the toll lane right now? Go ahead. Totally optional. We're not going to force you, but if you don't want to sit in this parking lot, jump in. And it flexes up or down based on, so if too many people take $6, it goes to 7. And then it goes to 8, 9, whatever. And then in the middle of the night, it's 0. And so I would also put flex tolling on there as well, so that way, if it's a way to get the bridge paid off faster by people who volunteer the money. And that's how I would do it, because nobody likes tolls, but if that is the only avenue left available to us, then we're going to have to do it.
Okay, another issue that has to do with projects and removing a certain amount of money once it's done, local option sales tax.
Yes.
Local communities sometimes want to build a project in their area, and they could have the option to raise their own sales tax. The voters would vote on whatever project it is and decide whether they want to raise it by a small amount, and then it would go away once the project is completed. Are you in favor of that type of
For
legislation?
one-offs, yes. For permanent, no.
Okay.
Mostly because, again, it's like, you should be able to explain what the one-offs are, which I assume they would be able to do. So I don't have a problem with that, provided that it makes sense to them. And if the local community decides they want to pay more tax for a local thing, they should be able to do it.
Okay. And then minimum wage. You have said you're in favor of raising the minimum wage.
Yes.
But
and I know you guys aren't big fans of that around here.
But you want to exempt small businesses. So that is interesting. What is your definition of a small business?
Right. So the government defines small businesses in many different ways. I would take an existing definition and just copy it. Okay. So like maybe the Obamacare mandate, they have it like, I think it's less than 50 employees. Let's just find some definition and just peg to it, so that way we don't have to figure that out. I mean, somebody's already wrestled with this. But the idea there is basically, so one of the interesting things about getting a business degree now is finding out how many things have changed from 30 years ago. So for example, this whole let's go in and we'll cut 20% of a company to save money. They don't teach that anymore because it doesn't work. And by the same token, they're also teaching the fact that if you continue to peg your employees to minimum wage, you will have a higher rate of employee turnover. And in fact, a lot of companies, Costco in particular, have figured this out. And they offer a salary far above minimum wage for this exact reason. And the problem with the other companies that do it is that the minimum wage was supposed to be a living wage, but now it is essentially the peg to which every company who thinks like a 20th century business attaches their wage to, because they cannot legally just give money to employees without being vulnerable to shareholder lawsuits. Unless they make the case that it's going to save them money down the road, which is what Costco is doing. Walmart is starting to dip their toe in the water on that as well. They've raised it to $8 or $9 depending on where you're at. So that they're coming around on that side, but I was trying to figure out, so the reason why you would want to raise minimum wage is because this gets spent out instantly back into the economy. Every dollar that goes up goes right back in. The problem with it is that there is a 30 to 60 day delay between when that money hits the pocketbooks of the people who will spend it and when it gets spent out. And the problem there is, and I got this from talking to friends of mine who own restaurants in particular, restaurants must pay a wage that is either, they got a minimum wage for tip, but they have to make them whole up to minimum wage if they miss. So the reason why you'd want to carve out small businesses is a bar that employs 6 people. It's too risky for them to continue to try to employ somebody after a minimum wage hike because they don't know if they're going to be able to hit that, especially given that there's a 30 to 60 day lag time in there. So the idea was, and he was the one who actually gave it to me, was like, why don't you just carve out small business? He's like, we're not the ones that are like keeping the downward pressure on this anyhow. And I said, in fact, if minimum wage was completely exempt, which if people want to do that for small businesses, I'm fine. You tell me. I don't know that we need to, but it's on the table. Would be, they're not the ones holding the wages down. His thing was talking about, small businesses should be able to let people work for them for free. Mm-hmm. Not because that's a good idea, but sometimes people are okay with that. And he's like, we're not holding wages down. If you have a problem with me not paying minimum wage, go work for Walmart. is his idea. And he's not saying he wouldn't, he just needs that 30 to 60 day flexibility so that when people come in and they finally have the money to spend, that, you know, when he finally gets hit with that, he's in good shape. I mean, and he understands this because in an interesting way, he was against minimum wage until he had a conversation with two people that come to his bar all the time. They come in every Friday, they buy 2 beers, they nurse them, they stay there for 4 hours, and then they go. And they're nice people. And he talked to him, and he's like, yeah, why do you guys only buy 2 beers every Friday? And they said, we make minimum wage, this is it. And he said, if you gave them a bump, they could probably buy 3 or 4 beers. So in 30 to 60 days, this works out great for me. He said, but in the meantime, I'd have to lay everybody off. So the idea is that if it turns out that large businesses, and I'm thinking McDonald's in particular, have already advocated for a higher minimum wage, the ones who are the most impacted by it are the small businesses, and they are not the problem that we are trying to solve minimum wage. Let's just opt them out, and then should be good. Because at the end of the day, if a small business 6 months down the road is still paying substantially less than minimum wage, they're probably not going to have an easy time hiring people. So market forces allow that to catch up, and it gives them that lead time to where they can just, you know, so now they're not up against the wall for 60 days trying to figure out where do I get this extra 4% income from.
Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but right to work. You have said that at this point you would veto it because there's not enough information out there for you to support it at this point. What information are we missing on this?
Well, so, I mean, it's sort of, in theory, I think right to work would create jobs in the same way that you could use a bazooka to kill a mosquito. It would work, but there's a very large blast radius out there, and you don't want to remove the ability for people to have salary advocates for them. You know, for example, like nobody's anti-sports agent. Well, but that's kind of the same thing. And so, and the real problem really is it's anti-unions, which I'm not saying unions are good. I have a very dim view of them, having worked for Kroger as a bagger. I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who actually works for Kroger's union, and I said, good news, I do not like your union. I will not pass right to work, because I can't prove that it's an efficient way to do it. Our unemployment is lower than 2 right-to-work states north and south of us. And in theory, it does seem to be the case that you would move in to a place where you didn't have to deal with unions all the time. But in practice, it doesn't seem to be one of the primary considerations. Like I mentioned before, job training is paramount. Well, what do unions do? Job training. Like they actually do that in their own industry. So it seems to me to be foolish to remove partial benefit to get a partial other benefit that we can't necessarily prove. But I will say this, some unions are monopolies and they don't function well, and I'm not a big fan of it, but it seems like a blanket carte blanche rule is not the way to solve this problem. If I get through the other 100 things that I'd like to do that would create jobs and then reach right to work, I'll probably take a look at it, but I got a big list and I'm pretty sure I'm not getting through it in 4 years.
But even right now, not every company has to be unionized.
Right.
It's, you know, it's not everybody is unionized. And this would just allow a worker. So if I didn't want to be a member of the union at Kroger, I could choose not to be.
Oh, believe me, when I was 16, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? And it dragged me down below minimum wage, as it turns out. So I totally understand this. My problem is that on the specific cases it does work, there are some broader unintended consequences to this legislation that I don't like. But I'm willing to have a conversation about it. I mean, if we've got people who are like, oh, okay, we found an implementation that actually seems to work, well, all right, we'll take a look at it. But in the meantime, like in particular, you know, what if, you know, Warren County passes this thing, which they did, and lo and behold, oh, never mind, for whatever reason in Kentucky, we can prove this is effective. Well, all right, then game on. So that's where I'm at on that. I'm not anti it because I'm against the concept. I just don't believe that it is an effective way to accomplish growing jobs.